Thank you for choosing to watch our video. Please like and subscribe to our channel and click the bell icon for notifications of new content. Leave us a comment and watch the other videos that we're happy to provide for you. And now, on to the sermon.
God asked the prophet Elijah a question in 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 9, that kind of becomes the entire basis of what we're going to study this morning. And we're going to study it in an unusual way, because what we're going to do is to link this to a study of and an examination of parenting. No one is the perfect parent. No one's a perfect child. You know, I have somewhat the liberty now. Ramsey's moved away. Grayson is at Union Road half of the time. So there are moments when I can know when to hit this, and it'd be easier to talk about because I can stand up and understand that all of the people who could possibly fact check me as a parent are gone, except I didn't anticipate the Sunday after Thanksgiving. That was my shortcoming. Nevertheless, we have to press on. In 1 Kings chapter 19, we've got this example of what is taking place with Elijah and God. And interestingly enough, the way that God handles Elijah is the way that parents can handle their children and can deal with their children all through this account. Now, I've mentioned that there's this one question that we're going to deal with in verse 9, but really it's going to be the entire context of verses 1 through 18. And we're going to look at these parenting realities from God toward Elijah. So especially, if you're here this morning and you've got children with you, and I can see that there's a bunch of you out in the audience, listen carefully. However, if you're here this morning and you don't have children, a lot of times I can naturally apply this to grandparents and it works just fine. It's going to work just fine this morning. But I want you to still listen carefully to it, because we're going to make it hopefully come good at the end. So 7 parenting realities as far as God and as far as Elijah are concerned. How should we respond? How do they respond? Let's get into the text and let's find out. 1 Kings chapter 19, let's kind of lay into the episode here beginning in verse 1. And Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done. This references the previous chapter of chapter 18 and the contest between Elijah and the prophets of Baal in Mount Carmel. I'll bring that up as we go through the lesson. And also how he had executed all of the prophets with the sword, because Elijah, because he had God on his side, was victorious. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, "So let the gods do to me and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time." In essence, Elijah, I'm going to kill you. So the wife of Ahab, the wife of the king, the queen, says, "Elijah, I'm going to kill you." Verse 3. And when he saw that, he arose and he ran for his life. He went to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and he left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a broom tree, and he prayed that he might die. And he said, "It is enough now, Lord. Take my life, for I am no better than my father." So this is the situation. Now, understanding how God is about to deal with Elijah over the next several verses, what are the lessons that we can learn? I want us to begin, first of all, with these 7 principles, is that we ensure physical needs are met. Let's go on in verse 5. We're going to read down through verse 8. So starting in verse 5, now reading down through verse 8. Then as he lay and he slept under a broom tree, suddenly an angel touched him and said to him, "Arise and eat." Then he looked, and there by his head was a cake baked on coals and a jar of water. So he ate and he drank and he lay down again. The angel of the Lord came back a second time, touched him, and said, "Arise and eat, because the journey is too great for you." So he arose, he ate, and he drank, and he went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights, as far as Horeb, that was south, the mountain of God. So God wants us, you think about God toward parenting, God wants to provide for our needs. And that's exactly the same that absolutely every parent wants to do for their child. Matthew chapter 7. Turn over to Matthew chapter 7, and you can see this. This is the Lord Jesus Christ talking. Matthew chapter 7. Matthew chapter 7, let's begin reading in verse 7. This is speaking about prayer, but in prayer it pulls in what we want to prove. Matthew 7, verse 7, ask and it'll be given to you, seek and you will find, knock and it'll be open to you. For everyone who asks receives, and he who seeks finds, and to him who knocks it'll be open. What man is there among you? If his son asks for bread, we'll give him a stone. Or if he asks for a fish, we'll give him a serpent. If you then, being evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give good things to those who ask Him? So what's it saying? It's saying that under every single certain circumstance, parents want to provide for their children. Now we understand that, and of course we know that there are some exceptions, but they're relatively few. When you think about the whole population, most of the time we want to provide for our children. Now that doesn't absolve our children from doing right and from acting right. But you need to think and you need to understand that we are beings with spirit and with body. We don't take care of the body, then it's going to be hard for the spirit to act in a way that it can. You get the idea right off the bat. God is trying to show Elijah that rest and that nourishment are important. We live such busy lifestyles. We lived it when our children were little, but we live such busy lifestyles, and we run to and there. We've got something going every night. And so you get kids kind of on this diet of sodas and fast food, and it's no wonder that they want to misbehave. So we ensure, first of all, here's God ensuring, making absolutely sure that their physical needs are taken care of. Think about it this way. If you're a parent and you've got children who are, again, relatively younger, and that night is just a disaster. I mean, you're ready to call it, you're ready to ground them for the rest of their lives. Sometimes the best thing you can do, feed them something good and stick them in the bed. It might be 6, it might be 6:30, it might be 7, it might be really early. You might think, well, that's kind of self-serving because it just keeps you and it prevents you from blowing your top. Well, maybe, but as every good parent knows, you're saving the child from themselves. Because probably greater than 9 times out of 10, they're going to wake up the next morning and everything is going to be back to normal. If it's not, then you can address it with some harder disciplinary measures, but probably it's going to be fine. So here was Elijah at this critical, crucial moment in his life, and we're about to talk about it again in just a second. And what does God do? What's the first step? He ensures that he is physically taken care of. That's going to start to bring Elijah out of the spot where he is. We'd be remiss if we passed through this account and we didn't at least stop and make this comment. We need to take care of, in this physical way, our children, the spirit and the body. But let's consider another idea as we've read through verses 5 through 8, is that God didn't dignify anything that was unreasonable with engagement or with argument. Now, here's what I mean, and I'll admit I'm kind of making an argument from silence here. But you've got 5 through 8, we just read it, and you can see how God responds. So here's what God didn't do. Elijah wants to die. Look back with me there in the 4th verse. It is enough now, Lord, take my life, for I am no better than my father. So God didn't come back and say, well, no, Elijah, I'm not going to kill you. God didn't even dignify it with a response. As a parent, you're not obligated to respond to everything that your child says. And sometimes it's going to get rough. I was pretty fortunate, I'll have to say. I was pretty fortunate with our kids. I didn't have to go through the rejoinders of "I hate you" or to see the massive eye rolls. We didn't deal with that. But I know that a lot of parents do. And I think, and it's going to sound kind of harsh, but Proverbs chapter 26, verse 4. Proverbs chapter 26, verse 4 gives some really helpful advice. Proverbs chapter 26 and verse 4. And we also want to consider verse 5 because there is a counterpoint to this, as there is a lot of times with all divine truth. Proverbs chapter 26, verse 4. Look what it says. "Do not answer a fool according to his folly, lest you also be like him." So sometimes when you're trying to be the parent, and most definitely when you're trying to be the Christian, when you're trying to be the righteous one because they're the child, it's easy to kind of get drawn down the rat hole and you end up both looking pretty unrighteous. Do not answer a fool according to his folly. Now I know it, I'm sorry, it sounds harsh. But let's face it, we've all been foolish at times. Do not answer a fool according to his folly. Now, there are times, and I mentioned this, and I don't want to leave it because you're probably glancing down in verse 5, where it says, "Answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes." Sometimes, when things are said, people need to be corrected. They need to understand, and they need to realize. Again, it seems hard, but they need to realize that they're being foolish. But as a parent, you are not required to respond to every single thing. Now, I've mentioned before, and I want to mention it again, that there are lots and lots of times where you're going to get kind of into a cycle, a circle with your children. You're going to ask them to do something, and they're going to ask, "But why?" And there are lots and lots of times where that's incredibly helpful. Because you want your children to see that there's reasonableness behind what you're asking them to do. Now, as they continue, especially as they're younger kids, the but whys will just continue and continue and continue. And at some point, you just kind of have to tie it off and say, "Well, that's enough for today. That's enough for this question. Now go ahead and do what I've asked you to do." But realize, God didn't come back and argue and fuss and fight about it. God was the one in control. You're the parent. They're the child. And you don't have to deal with all of the unreasonables, and you certainly don't have to deal with all of the argumentation. God didn't, and we don't have to as well. A great principle. Now, let's think about a third one. Let's consider some context before we determine discipline. Now, let's read starting in verse 9. So back to 1 Kings chapter 19. Now, 1 Kings chapter 19, now we're going to read in verse 9. Principle number 3. "And there he went into a cave, and he spent the night in that place. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said to him, 'What are you doing here, Elijah?'" There's our question. What are you doing here, Elijah? So he said, "I've been very zealous for the Lord God of hosts, for the children of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword, and I alone am left, and they seek to take my life." Then he said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord." And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind tore into the mountains and broke the rocks in pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind, and after the wind an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake, and after the earthquake a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire, and after the fire a still small voice. So it was, when Elijah heard it, that he wrapped his face in the mantle, and he went out and he stood in the entrance of the cave, and suddenly a voice came to him and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" So the wind and the earthquake and the fire, these are actually common ways that God used judgment. You look back in the Old Testament, you can see instances of this. It reminds you of how the mountain was when God gave the law to Moses at Mount Sinai, which, by the way, since Elijah was in the region of Horeb, this is basically where he was. So Elijah had all of this going on. I mean, this entire display laid out in front of him, but God wasn't there. He came to him, as the text says, in a very still voice, in a very delicate, whispering voice. A delicate, whispering voice. God provided for his needs first, and then he's going to rebuke him. God knew at this point in time, Elijah had been working for him for 3.5 years. The account is relatively small. Elijah just literally walks onto the stage of biblical history beginning in 1 Kings chapter 17. We have the account in chapter 18, now we're in chapter 19. But in all of that space of time, 3.5 years have gone by, and Elijah has had to deal with a lot. And God knew that. And so the point that we want to make is that, God could have come down really hard, like a hammer on him. But God understood the context of the circumstance and the feelings that he had in that moment. And God addresses him in this very light, delicate moment. And I think that's something to remember. When we've had kids, for example, who've acted really good all day at school, and they come home and there starts to be some trouble, we kind of understand they've done really, really well. Maybe they're kind of reaching a natural part in their day, kind of in the rhythm of their day where they're going to misbehave some more. We kind of understand that. Or maybe as we would relate it to here, we've had a gospel meeting, and we mentioned that we're having a meeting in March, and we've had meeting after meeting after meeting, and families have brought their kids every single night. That's just fantastic. But you get to the end of the week, and, admittedly, we're all tired. Even the adults are tired who don't have any children. And so when it comes to Saturday, and they're less than perfect angels, we might remember the context of everything that's going on. Because I believe God did that with Elijah. He could have just said, come down and just said, look, close your mouth and you're going to do what I tell you right this second. No, a still, delicate voice. I'm reminded, 1 Peter chapter 3. 1 Peter chapter 3, and let's look in verse 7. 1 Peter chapter 3, looking in verse 7. I'll make this point now, and I'll make this point at least one other time, because I think it's worthy to reiterate to me constantly. One of the finest ways that you can be a parent is by understanding that first and foremost, you are a child of God. So let me kind of illustrate this just a little bit. 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 7. Husbands likewise deal with them, the wives, with understanding, giving honor to the wife as to the weaker vessel, and as being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers be not hindered. So husbands dwell with their wives. The New King James Version says with understanding. Other versions say consideration. Other versions say, and I like this word the best, thoughtfulness. Thoughtfulness. You be a Christian. If you can just be the kind of Christian that you need to be, then the relationship between husbands and wives is going to be a lot smoother. But the same can be said for the relationship between parents and children. Dwell with them according to understanding, to consideration, with thoughtfulness. With who? Yes, husbands, yes, with your wives. But don't forget about your children. Thoughtfulness. And I know there's been circumstances, there's been occasions where I haven't done that, and I should have. But here's God, the perfect parent, being the perfect teacher for all of us. Make sure that their needs are met, and when there is the need to get them going in a different direction, rebuking, discipline, let's call it what it was dealt with in the context of everything else. Parents would be wise to learn from that. But let's keep going. Let's keep going. Let's go back to number 4. Let's go back to 4. Now, in going back to 4, we're going to actually go back to verse 13. So back to 1 Kings chapter 19, let's look in verse 13. So 1 Kings chapter 19, looking in verse 13. So it was that when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in the mantle. He went out and he stood in the entrance of the cave. And suddenly a voice came to him and he said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" It's your job as a parent to get your children to always see the bigger picture. Because they are children, they haven't learned how to do that. This is what you're going to have to do. They understand the realities of what a child is and what, however old your children are, 6 or 8 or 10 or 12 or what, that's the reality they understand. You have to get them to understand the bigger picture. This is what God needed Elijah to do. And children a lot of times kind of point to all kinds of exceptions as to why they shouldn't do what they're supposed to do. Elijah even does it. Verse 14. Look at Elijah. Here's verse 14. "I've been very zealous for the Lord God of hosts, because the children of Israel have forsaken your covenant. They've torn down your altars. They've killed your prophets with the sword, and I alone am left, and they seek to take my life." It's not that God didn't listen. He's going to deal with that. And we'll see it. It's not that God didn't listen, and it's not that God didn't care. Gregory said that the question here in verse 13 essentially focuses Elijah to make him carefully consider his current position and then his future destiny. So what does that mean in the context of raising children? Maybe you have grown up and are now raising your children by putting into motion certain little phrases or little statements or just maybe single words. Let me give you an illustration. A friend, I'd read this one time, a friend used it with his children. Use it, by the way. He'd probably think that's the neatest thing in the world if people learned it and then used it too. He asked his children, "When do we obey?" Their proper, appropriate response would be, "Right away." When do we obey? And they would say, "Right away." So sometimes it's easy when you ask children, "When do we obey?" They might say right away, but just like in verse 14, no. And maybe there is purposefulness in verse 9 and in verse 14. "Why are you here, Elijah?" It kind of grabs the attention. You know, if I were to say, "Ramsey, when do we obey?" And she would say, "Right away." What does that do? Well, it captures that attention. And that's what God was trying to do with Elijah. Very, very similar to the fact of this question here. Elijah needed to see that where he was not where God wanted him to be, which was self-loathing and self-pity in Horeb. God needed him someplace else. And because he did need him someplace else, we move on and we consider now this fifth one. We redirect them to what they ought to be, what they should be doing. Let's go back to verse 15. 1 Kings chapter 19, now beginning in verse 15. "Then the Lord said to him," this is fifth principle, make sure they do what they're doing, know what they're doing. "Then the Lord said to him, go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus, and when you arrive, anoint Hazael as king over Syria, and you will anoint Jehu the son of Nimshi as king over Israel, and Elisha the son of Shaphat of Abel-Meholah, and you will anoint a prophet in your place. It will be that whoever escapes the sword of Hazael, Jehu will kill. Whoever escapes the sword of Jehu, Elisha will kill." So, here's what's going on. Elijah could have said, "Well, Lord, what do I need to do?" And the Lord could have easily said, "Look, let me just take care of it." But that's not what God did. Here was Elijah at this point, a bad point in his life. And the Lord said, "You're going to have to get back to work." Now think about this in our whole element of parenting this morning. How did it make you feel when you were given something to do and your parent comes along, your mom and my dad could get just so instantly frustrated with me. How did it make you feel if your parent comes along and just grabs it away and says, no, never mind, let me do it. I'll just do it. Never mind, let me do it. Because as a parent, you know that you can do it much better and much faster if you just grabbed it and did it yourself. Grayson, when he was growing up, we had the 97 Ford F-150, which was actually, as an experimental vehicle, quite good to have. So as he was getting 12 or 13 years old, I could start teaching him how to do things. And on a 97 Ford F-150, there was no shortage of things to do. So he could learn how to change oil. He could learn how to, let's see, what did we do? Replace starters in it. We replaced idler pulleys. Rich shaking his head. We did a radiator together. Spark plugs. Spark plugs were great. And Ford F-150 in those years, any little slight twist the wrong way snapped the spark plug off in the head. Richard, you know about that. Would snap the spark plug off in the head. So we'd go out and I would teach him how to replace them. And I'd have to go in there and I would have to just pop it loose and then re-snug it without him actually realizing what was taking place and then telling him to go and do it, knowing that I could set him up to be successful at it and not damage anything in the process. So it was kind of a win-win. But it would have been easy for me to just grab it away and say, no, let me do it, because I know I can do it faster. I know I can do it better. Why? Because I'm a grown-up and I've done it before. Guys, you need to make absolutely sure that we not only can redirect them to what they ought to be doing, but also as well help them to do it. Now, if we think about this in a spiritual application, which we need to, let's look in Psalm 78. Because every single parent, we're going to teach them how to do the simple things, car maintenance and stuff around the house, mowing the yard and all of that stuff. And that stuff is necessary. But guys, make absolutely sure that you don't ever leave this point without the really, really important stuff. Psalm 78, and let's start reading in the 4th verse. Psalm 78, start reading in the 4th verse. We will not hide them from their children, telling to the generation to come the praises of the Lord, His strength, His wonderful works that He has done. So yes, get your clothes on because we're going to go to church. I'm trying to get myself out of the habit of saying that. Sure, you're going to go. And sure, you're going to do what's right. Well, what are you doing the rest of the week? So verse 4, great instruction. Tell them of the praises of the Lord, His strength, His wonderful works that He's done, for He established a testimony in Jacob. He appointed a law in Israel, which He commanded our fathers, that they should make them known to their children, that the generation to come might know them, the children who would be born, that they may arise and declare them to their children, that they may set their hope in God and not forget the works of God, but keep His commandments, and may not be like their fathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation that had not set its heart aright, and whose spirit was not faithful to God. We teach them, and we teach them in the absolute most important thing. Proverbs chapter 29, verse 17. Stop off in Proverbs chapter 29, verse 17 as we make our way to the New Testament. Proverbs chapter 29, looking in the 17th verse. Proverbs 29, 17, correct your son, and he will give you rest. Yes, and he will delight your soul. So correct, another word for correct is instruct. Instruct. Direct them in what they should be doing. And what will they do? They'll give delight to your soul. Now, 2 Corinthians chapter 8, just notice this before we move on. 2 Corinthians chapter 8, and look starting in verse 10. 2 Corinthians 8, starting in verse 10. We read this a lot around the time of the contribution because here was Paul trying to get the Corinthians to contribute to a very, very noble cause. And he says in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, starting in verse 10, and in this I give advice. I give a little tip. It is to your advantage not only to be doing what you began and were desiring to do a year ago, but now you must complete the doing of it. That as there was a readiness to desire it, so there may also be a completion out of what you have. For if there is first a willing mind, it is accepted according to what one has and not according to what one does not have. What's he doing? He's encouraging them to do what they need to do. And that's what we do with our children. But we absolutely have to understand another principle, and that is we never ever set them up to fail. God gave Elijah very clear instructions. He gave him a very clear objective. He gave him the support as that he could do. And then he expected him to do it. And when we think about the fact of what we do and how we try our very best in raising our children, there's kind of a process. So, for example, we tell them what to do, we show them what to do, we stand back until they do it themselves. And educators know that this is the process by which you grab hold of these things and you're capable of doing them. That's what God did with him. He made absolutely sure that he could give him the help and the assistance that he needed to accomplish his task. Colossians chapter 3, let's look in verse 12. Colossians chapter 3, looking in verse 12. Here's another one of these circumstances and situations where we need to remember that being a Christian means that you're helpful and that you're assisting in your children's development and in your children's life. Colossians chapter 3, starting in verse 12. Therefore, as the elect of God, holy and beloved, put on tender mercies, kindness, humility, meekness, long-suffering to your children. Bearing with one another and forgiving one another if anyone has a complaint against another, even as Christ forgave you, so you must also do to your children. But above all these things, put on love, which is the bond of perfection with your children. And let the peace of God rule in your hearts, to which also you were called in one body, and be thankful for your children. That kind of attitude, that kind of heart is going to give them the help and the assistance that they need when it comes to doing the task that you want them to accomplish. You don't set them up to fail and then get mad at them because they do indeed fail. That's not what God did as a loving parent. But the final thing that He did, if you'll go back with me to 1 Kings chapter 19 now, let's look in verse 18. The final thing that God did, 1 Kings chapter 19 and looking in verse 18, and this will finish up the text for us this morning. 1 Kings chapter 19 verse 18, picking up in the 17th verse, just notice, it shall be that whoever escapes the sword of Hazael, Jehu will kill. Whoever escapes the sword of Jehu, Elisha will kill. And then God addresses the way that he felt in that 14th verse. Remember, Elijah had said, and all of those things were true. I mean, it's not like Elijah was just creating something out of thin air. Elijah was talking about how difficult things were. But look in the 18th verse. Yet I have reserved 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him. So after we redirect, after we give clear instructions, after we have taught them and after we have instructed them, we need to give them a better, greater perspective. It's going to feel like, especially at school, that they are all alone. Some of us had to grow up as far as being Christians are concerned, and when we became Christians early in our lives, 13, 14, 15 years old, that as far as the congregation was concerned, there was not a lot of other young people. Thankfully, at least in this congregation and certainly in this town, we've got all kinds of opportunities. Opportunities where we have vacation Bible schools and we have devotionals and we have youth weekends. We even have summer camp. One year, a couple of years ago or so, the summer camp was here in the county or pretty well close to it. And all of these are constant opportunities for kids to realize that they're not alone. For kids to realize that there are other kids out there with like precious faith who want to love Jesus Christ just as much as they do and who want to live and do right before God. I think about the way that I kind of wanted to put it into to give this perspective. In Daniel chapter 3, verses 16, 17, and 18, when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused, and being young men, we don't know how young, but being young men, they refused to bow down to the image that Nebuchadnezzar had built. And so what our kids need to do is that they need to find their Shadrach, Meshach, and their Abednego. And we've got opportunities. Thankful to the Lord that we have opportunities in this very town and in this very congregation. With everything that goes on among hundreds of Christians here in this town, that they can find those people and they can have the perspective that they need to have, because that's what God was doing as a parent. Remember, don't you ever think that you're by yourself, because I've got a lot of people here who are zealous to do the will of the Lord, who are zealous to stand with you, who are zealous to help you get to heaven. Our children need to hear that. So, all of these principles. And I ask you, as we've kind of gotten through the lesson, to bear with me. And here's the reason that I want you to bear with me. And I'm going to leave this up here just for a moment. If you want to memorize it, if you want to write it down, or if you want to just take a picture with it on your phone, here is the secret. This works. These 7 principles work in a lot more applications than just with your children. Employers, elders, anyone who has any position of authority, when you're working with people who are under you in the chain of command, these principles work. They literally are the perfect parenting tips from God. And one of the greatest parts of being able to study them is to understand how the mind of the Lord works in particular circumstances and in particular contexts within people's lives. And the neat part about all of this is that we get such a nice unfolding of this with Elijah in 1 Kings chapter 19. Now the nice part is, and as we think about our invitation, the nice part is Elijah had a choice to make, because after God had told him to do all of that in verses 15, 16, and 17, and after he had reassured him in verse 18, it literally was put within the lap of Elijah, and he was going to have to decide. And you know what he did? He went right back and he did what God wanted him to do. And so now, as it were, it's kind of in your lap for you to decide what to do with it. Clearly, from the lesson, what you do as a parent, and maybe you even start doing things differently today with your children, having learned this and having seen this. Maybe you think about the fact of just getting back how good and how wonderful and how great and how awesome God is in the way that He deals with His children. And maybe that makes an impression on you. In fact, such an impression that you're ready to give your obedience and give your life to God and actually start to serve Him. Because why? You're learning what He is and what He does and how great He is. That's what that's what we're here to do, is to try to build up people's resilience against the world and to try to build up their desire to do the will of God. We've got a song of invitation. We always announce it. We always use one, only because it's a convenient time for you to come up here and talk to us about what's going on in your mind, about what's in your heart, about serving the Lord Jesus Christ better. Or maybe you want to talk to one of us afterwards about it. That's fine. We want you to make a decision for doing right, for doing good, for being a just and holy person. That's what Elijah did. Elijah needed help. There are moments in his life where he dipped down. There's going to be moments in your children's lives where they're going to dip down. But we're hopefully going to use the right approach to not just bring them out of it, but bring them out of it far better on the other side than they were before. To raise them to be good, godly people, That's our invitation. That's what certainly we want for you and what we want you to respond to this morning. Please, let's do it as we stand and sing.